Picture this. You're tucking your child into bed, opening their favorite fairy tale book, and beginning the familiar story of Rumpelstiltskin. A quirky little man who can spin straw into gold, a clever miller's daughter who outsmarts him, and a happy ending where she keeps her baby and becomes queen. Just another whimsical bedtime story, right? Wrong. What if I told you that Rumpelstiltskin wasn't originally a fairy tale at all? What if I told you it was a survival guide, passed down through generations of terrified parents who lived in constant fear that mysterious strangers would appear at their doors, offering impossible bargains that always ended the same way, with their children vanishing forever? The story you think you know, the one sanitized by Disney and cleaned up by the Brothers Grimm, is actually one of medieval Europe's most documented horror stories. Behind the spinning wheels and golden thread lies a web of real-life child trafficking networks, ritualistic murders, and survival tactics that parents use to teach their daughters how to stay alive in a world where children were currency and desperate families made deals with devils they couldn't afford to pay. Every element of the Rumpelstiltskin story corresponds to documented historical practices that plagued medieval Germany for centuries. The mysterious little man, he was real, part of a network of human traffickers who specialized in acquiring children for various horrible purposes. The spinning of straw into gold, that was code for something far more sinister, the process by which innocent children were transformed into valuable commodities. The guessing of the true name, that was a real ritual, with deadly consequences for those who lost the game. You're about to discover that your favorite childhood story has a body count. The Brothers Grimm weren't collecting fairy tales, they were documenting crime scenes that had haunted German communities for generations. The true origins of Rumpelstiltskin reveal a medieval world where children disappeared in the night, where families made impossible choices to survive, and where knowing the right name could mean the difference between life and death. This isn't a story about magic. It's a story about human trafficking, ritual murder, and the lengths parents would go to protect their children from predators who offered golden opportunities that came with prices too terrible to imagine. The real Rumpelstiltskin wasn't defeated by clever wordplay. He was one of medieval Europe's most successful child traffickers, and his victims numbered in the hundreds. The spinning wheel isn't turning anymore. It's time to unravel the truth. In 1456, the City Council of Nuremberg issued an urgent decree that would be copied by authorities across the Holy Roman Empire. No citizen shall permit entry to any person claiming mastery of the golden arts, nor shall any child be left unattended when such persons are reported in the vicinity. This wasn't about actual gold, it was about children and the mysterious network of traffickers who had been stealing them for decades. Medieval court records from across Germany document a sophisticated criminal organization that historians now call the Gold Spinners Guild, though that wasn't what they called themselves at the time. These weren't random kidnappers or opportunistic criminals. They were organized, methodical, and devastatingly effective at what they did, acquiring children for wealthy clients who paid enormous sums for young workers, servants, and worse. The guild operated using a specific methodology that directly parallels the Rumpelstiltskin story. Members would appear in struggling communities during times of economic hardship, failed harvests, guild disputes, or local conflicts that left families desperate. They would approach parents with impossible offers, solutions to debts that couldn't be paid, opportunities for advancement that seemed too good to be true, or trades that would solve one problem while creating another. The spinning straw into gold metaphor wasn't about magic. It was trafficker code for the process of transforming worthless, rural children into valuable urban commodities. Court documents from Munich dated 1478 describe how traffickers would promise to teach children valuable skills that would make them worth their weight in gold to wealthy households. What these skills actually entailed was carefully omitted from the sales pitch. Hans Wertheim, a captured trafficker tried in Frankfurt in 1489, confessed under torture to acquiring over 200 children across a 15-year period. His testimony reveals the sophisticated network behind these operations. Traffickers would scout rural areas during harvest festivals, market days, and religious celebrations, times when children would be visible and families would be distracted. They worked in teams. One member would assess the family's desperation level, another would make the initial contact, and a third would handle the actual acquisition. The spinning wheel symbolism wasn't random either. Textile work was one of the few legitimate ways poor children could earn money, and traffickers exploited this by claiming they represented wealthy cloth merchants seeking workers. They would display samples of fine thread, sometimes actually gold spun, as proof of the lucrative opportunities awaiting children who joined their operations. Parents saw their children's futures literally spinning before their eyes, transformed from rural poverty into urban prosperity. But the reality was horrifically different. Children acquired by the Gold Spinners Guild were sorted into different categories based on age, appearance, and perceived intelligence. The youngest and most attractive were sold to wealthy households as personal servants, a category that often included sexual exploitation. Older boys were frequently sold to mining operations or dangerous manufacturing guilds where life expectancy was measured in months, not years. Girls with quick hands were indeed put to work in textile operations, but under conditions so brutal that many died from exhaustion or toxic exposure within their first year. Archaeological evidence supports these testimonies. Excavations of medieval workshop sites across Germany have uncovered mass graves containing the remains of children aged 6–14, many showing signs of malnutrition, overwork, and traumatic injuries. Carbon dating places most of these burials between 1000, 550, precisely when court records show the Gold Spinners Guild was most active. The Guild's most diabolic innovation was their payment system. Rather than demanding immediate payment for their services, they would offer to solve families' problems in exchange for future considerations, usually a child who hadn't been born yet, or the first daughter to reach working age. This created a network of families bound by contracts they couldn't escape, living in constant fear that strangers would appear to collect what they were owed. Court records from Würzburg describe the case of the Müller family, yes, actually Millers, who made a deal with guild representatives during the famine of 1471. In exchange for grain that kept their family alive through winter, they promised their next daughter to the guild when she turned 12. When Anna Müller reached that age in 1483, the collectors appeared exactly as promised. Her parents' attempts to refuse were met with threats that extended to their entire extended family. Anna was never seen again. The 3-day deadline from the Rumpelstiltskin story reflects the guild's actual operating procedures. Traffickers would give families exactly 3 days to produce the child promised, or to find some alternative arrangement. This time limit served multiple purposes. It prevented families from fleeing or seeking help from authorities. It maintained the trafficker's schedule for moving through territories, and it created the psychological pressure necessary to force compliance. What makes this even more chilling is how normalized these arrangements became. Medieval German communities developed elaborate systems of lookouts, coded warnings, and hidden spaces where children could be concealed when guild members were spotted in the area. The phrase, spinning a tale, meaning to tell an elaborate lie, originates from this period when parents would create false stories about their children's whereabouts to protect them from traffickers. The guild's reach extended far beyond individual families. They maintained corrupt relationships with local authorities, church officials, and guild masters who would look the other way in exchange for payments or political favours. Some orphanages actually worked directly with traffickers, selling children who had no families to protect them. The entire system was designed to prey on the most vulnerable members of society, while ensuring that those with power had every incentive to maintain the status quo. By the early 1500s, the Gold Spinners Guild controlled a network that stretched from the Netherlands to Hungary, with major operations centres in every significant German city. They had evolved beyond simple child trafficking into a comprehensive criminal organisation involved in debt manipulation, political corruption, and systematic exploitation of economic desperation. The spinning wheel stopped turning when the guild finally overreached. In 1522, they attempted to acquire the daughter of a minor nobleman who had fallen into debt. Unlike the peasant families they usually targeted, this victim had connections to imperial authorities. The investigation that followed exposed the guild's operations across multiple territories, leading to mass arrests and executions that effectively destroyed the network. But by then, hundreds of children had already vanished into the guild's operations. The Rumpelstiltskin story emerged from the collective trauma of communities that had lived under this threat for generations, transforming real-life horror into a cautionary tale that might protect future children from similar fates. On October 13th, 1484, Brother Heinrich Kramer arrived in the German city of Innsbruck carrying a papal bull that would change medieval Europe forever. The Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, had just been published, and with it came official church recognition of practices that had terrorized communities for centuries. Among the documented witchcraft rituals was one that modern readers would recognize instantly: the binding of souls through the discovery of secret names. This wasn't superstition. Medieval courts across Europe recorded hundreds of cases where knowledge of someone's true name, their birth name, secret name, or ritual name, was used to gain power over them, often with deadly consequences. The practice was so widespread and so feared that many parents gave their children false names for public use, keeping their real names secret until death. The connection to Rumpelstiltskin becomes clear when we examine the court records from the German territories during the 15th and 16th centuries. Multiple documented cases describe mysterious individuals who would appear in communities and offer to solve impossible problems in exchange for seemingly simple payments. The catch? To finalize these deals, the client had to discover the stranger's true name within a specific time period, usually 3 days. Failure to do so meant forfeiting something precious, typically a child. The most detailed account comes from the trial records of Johann von Eck, tried for witchcraft in Munich in 1487. Von Eck was accused of entering into contracts with desperate families where he would solve their problems, curing illness, ending droughts, or eliminating debts, but only if they could discover his real name. Witnesses testified that he would provide cryptic clues and engage in elaborate psychological games, drawing out the process until families became emotionally invested in winning. But here's the terrifying part. Von Eck never intended for anyone to actually guess his name. The entire ritual was designed to create a sense of hope followed by devastating failure, after which families would be psychologically conditioned to accept whatever payment he demanded. Court testimony reveals that he used at least 15 different identities, complete with fabricated personal histories and false documentation. The name-guessing game was never about discovery, it was about manipulation. Medieval grimoires and ritual texts provide insight into why names held such power in these practices. According to court testimony from accused practitioners, knowing someone's true name allowed you to bind their soul, control their actions, or transfer their life force to another person. While we now understand these beliefs as psychological manipulation rather than supernatural power, the practical effects were devastatingly real. The ritual typically worked like this. The practitioner would arrive in a community during a crisis and approach the most desperate family. He would offer an impossible solution, but claim that cosmic forces required a specific ritual to make it work. The family would have to discover his true name by engaging in a game that seemed fair but was actually rigged. During the 3-day period, the practitioner would study the family's psychological weaknesses, map their social connections, and identify their most valuable possessions, especially children. When families inevitably failed the name-guessing challenge, they would be told that supernatural forces now demanded compensation for the attempted binding. This compensation always escalated far beyond what was originally discussed. A family seeking help with debt might end up owing their firstborn child. A parent trying to cure a sick infant might be told that the child's life could only be saved by sacrificing a healthy sibling. The psychological sophistication of these operations was remarkable. Practitioners would spend weeks observing communities before making contact, learning about family relationships, financial situations, and personal histories. They would plant accomplices who would, accidentally, reveal clues about the practitioner's supposed true name, creating false hope and encouraging families to keep playing the game even when they suspected they were being deceived. Brother Marcus Wolgemut, a Dominican inquisitor who investigated dozens of these cases, documented the consistent pattern in his 1,491 report to the papal authorities. Every case involved the same elements: a mysterious stranger with supernatural abilities, an impossible task requiring the discovery of a secret name, and payment that escalated far beyond the original agreement when families failed the challenge. What makes this even more chilling is how the practitioners used real psychological and social dynamics to make their supernatural claims appear credible. They would arrive during moments of genuine crisis, famines, plagues, or economic collapse, when desperate people were willing to believe in magical solutions. They exploited the medieval understanding of names as having mystical significance, a belief that was deeply embedded in Christian theology and folk tradition. The 3-day time limit wasn't arbitrary either. Psychological research shows that 3 days is the optimal period for creating false hope, followed by crushing disappointment. It's long enough for people to become emotionally invested in succeeding, but short enough to prevent them from seeking outside help or discovering the deception. Medieval practitioners understood this intuitively, using the time pressure to prevent rational decision-making. Court records from the trial of Anna Ziegler in 1502 provide the most detailed account of how the name-binding ritual actually worked. Ziegler was accused of using the practice to acquire children for a trafficking network. Her method was to approach families with sick children, claiming she could cure any illness by transferring it to supernatural beings, but only if the family could bind her spirit by discovering her true name. She would provide increasingly specific clues over the 3-day period, each one designed to seem like progress toward the solution. On the final day, she would reveal that her name was actually something completely different from all the clues, claiming that the family's failure to guess correctly meant that supernatural forces now owned their child's life force. The only way to prevent the child's death, she would explain, was to give the child to her for spiritual cleansing, which actually meant selling them to traffickers. The trial testimony reveals that Ziegler had used this method to acquire at least 40 children over a 12-year period. When authorities searched her residence, they found detailed notes on dozens of families, including psychological profiles, financial assessments, and rankings of which children would be most valuable to her clients. The name-guessing element of the Rumpelstiltskin story preserves the memory of these horrific practices, transforming documented psychological manipulation into a fairy tale where cleverness and luck could overcome supernatural evil. But the original practitioners were far more dangerous than any magical creature. They were human predators who understood exactly how to exploit desperation, hope, and the parent-child bond for profit. The real tragedy is how many families fell victim to these schemes because they were already at the breaking point. The practitioners specifically targeted communities dealing with poverty, illness, or social upheaval, preying on people who had exhausted all legitimate options and were willing to try anything to save their children. The ritual finally began to lose its power when literacy rates increased and communities developed better communication networks. Families could share information about suspicious strangers more quickly, and written records made it harder for practitioners to maintain multiple false identities. But by then, generations of children had already disappeared into these networks, and the psychological scars remained embedded in the folk memory that eventually became our fairy tales. In the winter of 1503, something began stalking the villages surrounding the Black Forest that would haunt German folklore for centuries. It wasn't a wolf or a bear, it was something far more terrifying because it was unmistakably human. Survivors described a small, twisted man with an unnaturally pale complexion and hands that seemed too large for his body. But the most disturbing detail was consistent across all accounts. He knew things about the children he targeted that no stranger should have known. The first recorded attack occurred in the village of Oberkirch on December 3rd, 1503. The Weaver family had been struggling through a particularly harsh winter when their 8-year-old daughter, Gretchen, disappeared from their cottage while her parents slept. The only evidence of her abduction was a pile of straw, arranged in an intricate pattern outside her window, with a single gold thread woven through it. Local authorities initially dismissed this as a random kidnapping, but when 3 more children vanished under identical circumstances within 2 weeks, panic spread throughout the region. What made these disappearances particularly terrifying was the precision with which the abductor operated. He seemed to know exactly which families were struggling financially, which children were old enough to work but young enough to control, and which households had no male relatives capable of protecting them. More disturbing still, witnesses reported seeing the same small figure near multiple villages, sometimes on the same night, despite the distances involved being impossible to cover on foot. Brother Wilhelm Steinbach, a Benedictine monk who investigated these disappearances for the church, documented cases across a 200-mile radius where the same figure appeared to desperate families, offering impossible solutions to their problems. His journal, preserved in the Munich State Archive, describes encounters that read like direct precursors to the Rumpelstiltskin story. In the village of Schwarzburg, the figure appeared to the Miller family during a grain shortage that threatened starvation. He offered to fill their stores with enough grain to last through winter, but only if they could correctly guess his name within 3 nights. When they failed, he demanded their youngest daughter as payment. The family refused, and within days, all their remaining grain had mysteriously spoiled. They eventually gave up the child to prevent the rest of their family from starving. What makes Steinbach's records particularly valuable is his systematic approach to documenting these encounters. He interviewed over 200 families across the region and found consistent patterns that suggest these weren't random crimes, but organized operations. The figure always appeared during times of crisis, always offered solutions that seemed magical, and always demanded children as payment when families couldn't meet his impossible challenges. The physical description was remarkably consistent across all accounts. Witnesses described a man between 4 and 5 feet tall, with prematurely aged features and skin so pale it seemed almost luminescent in moonlight. His clothing was described as fine but old-fashioned, suggesting wealth, but also isolation from normal society. Most disturbing were his hands, abnormally large and strong, with fingernails that had been deliberately sharpened to points. Modern analysis of these historical accounts suggests the perpetrator may have suffered from a form of dwarfism combined with albinism, conditions that would have made him instantly recognizable and probably excluded him from normal medieval society. This physical distinctiveness would have been both an advantage and a liability for someone engaged in criminal activities, memorable enough to inspire terror, but also impossible to hide once authorities began coordinating their investigations. The organized nature of these crimes becomes clear when examining the timing and geographical distribution of disappearances. The figure operated on a systematic schedule, moving through specific regions during predictable seasonal patterns. He appeared most frequently during late autumn and early winter, when food stores were running low and families were most vulnerable to offers of supernatural assistance. Church records from the monastery of Saint Blasien document 47 separate incidents between 1503 and 1517, where families reported encounters with the same figure. In 23 of these cases, children actually disappeared. In the remaining 24, families either successfully resisted his demands or found alternative solutions to their problems before the 3-day deadline expired. What's particularly chilling is how the figure seemed to have detailed knowledge about each family's situation before making contact. He would know about hidden debts, sick relatives, or failed crops that families hadn't discussed publicly. This suggests he had accomplices who gathered intelligence about potential targets, or that he spent considerable time observing communities before revealing himself. The 3-day pattern wasn't just psychological manipulation. It served practical purposes for someone operating a child trafficking network. 3 days gave him enough time to assess whether a family was genuinely desperate enough to surrender a child, while also providing a window to arrange transportation and documentation for newly acquired victims. Court records show that children taken during these encounters were typically moved out of the region within a week of their disappearance. The gold thread element that appeared at abduction sites wasn't random either. Medieval authorities understood it as a calling card, proof that the same individual was responsible for multiple disappearances. But modern analysis suggests it served a more practical purpose, marking successful acquisitions for accomplices who would handle the transportation phase of the operation. The figure's reign of terror ended abruptly in 1517 under circumstances that remain mysterious. The last recorded sighting was in the village of Villingen, where witnesses saw him attempting to abduct the daughter of a local blacksmith. The child's screams attracted attention, and several villagers cornered the figure in a barn. When they broke down the door minutes later, they found only the child, unconscious but unharmed, and a pile of clothing that seemed to have been abandoned in haste. Some witnesses claimed they saw a small figure fleeing into the forest, but no trace of him was ever found, despite extensive searches. Others insisted that the clothes were empty when they found them, as if their occupant had simply vanished. This ambiguity only added to the legend that grew around these events. What investigators did find were detailed records hidden in a hollow tree near the barn. These documents, written in multiple languages and scripts, contained information about over 300 families across the region, including assessments of their financial situations, family structures, and the ages and descriptions of their children. The records were organized like a merchant's inventory, with children rated according to various criteria that suggested different intended uses. The discovery of these records revealed the true scope of the operation. This wasn't a lone predator driven by supernatural obsessions. It was a sophisticated trafficking network that used theatrical elements and psychological manipulation to acquire valuable commodities in the form of children. The mysterious figure was essentially a specialized salesman, trained to exploit desperation and superstition to secure inventory for his clients. Local authorities attempted to track down the other individuals mentioned in the records, but most had already disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances. The investigation revealed a network that extended far beyond the Black Forest, with connections to similar operations in France, Austria, and the Low Countries. The Rumpelstiltskin story preserves the collective memory of these events, transforming a documented child trafficking operation into a cautionary tale about supernatural danger. But the real horror wasn't magical. It was human, organized, and devastatingly effective at exploiting the most vulnerable members of society. The children who disappeared during these years were never found. Their fate remains unknown, though historical records suggest most were sold into various forms of forced labor, sexual slavery, or worse. The gold thread that marked their disappearances became a symbol of hope in the fairy tale, a clue that led to the villain's downfall. But in reality, it was just a businessman's signature on transactions that destroyed hundreds of families and left entire communities living in terror of the small, pale figure who might appear at their doors on the darkest nights of winter. The final piece of the Rumpelstiltskin puzzle emerges from one of medieval history's most extensively documented cases of survival against impossible odds. In 1461, a young woman named Elizabeth Müller, yes, literally a miller's daughter, became the central figure in a legal case that would span 3 years and involve testimony from over 100 witnesses. Her story reveals how the fairy tale's clever heroine was based on real survival tactics used by medieval women to escape human trafficking networks. Elizabeth's ordeal began when her father, Johann Müller, accumulated massive debts to several powerful creditors, including members of the church hierarchy and local nobility. Medieval debt laws were brutally simple. Failure to repay meant forfeiture of property, and if property wasn't sufficient, debtors could lose their freedom or their family members. Johann owed the equivalent of 15 years' income, an impossible sum that effectively made his entire family property of his creditors. The court records from Augsburg, where Elizabeth's case was eventually tried, provide extraordinary detail about how medieval debt slavery actually worked. Creditors had legal rights to claim family members as payment, with young women being particularly valuable due to their potential for both labour and reproduction. Elizabeth, at 19, was considered prime property, old enough to work effectively, young enough to provide decades of service, and attractive enough to command premium prices in secondary markets. But Elizabeth had advantages that her traffickers didn't anticipate. As a miller's daughter, she was literate, unusual for women of her social class. She had also grown up around the complex mathematics of grain trading, giving her an understanding of contracts, percentages, and legal terminology that most peasants lacked. Most importantly, she had observed how her father's business operated, learning to read people's motivations and identify deception. When representatives of the trafficking network came to collect her as payment for her father's debts, Elizabeth employed a strategy that was both brilliant and desperate. She claimed to possess a supernatural ability that made her more valuable alive and free than enslaved, the power to transform worthless materials into gold through spinning. This wasn't random fantasy. Medieval alchemy was widely believed possible, and several documented cases existed of individuals claiming such abilities. The key to Elizabeth's deception was its specificity and her apparent confidence in demonstrating it. She offered to prove her abilities by spinning straw into gold, but only under carefully controlled conditions that she would dictate. She demanded 3 days to prepare, access to specific materials, and the right to work in private without observation. If she succeeded, her father's entire debt would be considered paid. If she failed, she would submit to whatever fate her creditors demanded. This proposition put her traffickers in a difficult position. If Elizabeth actually possessed supernatural abilities, capturing her could provide access to unlimited wealth, but allowing her to attempt the demonstration meant risking their investment in her acquisition. The 3-day timeline was crucial, long enough to seem reasonable, but short enough to prevent outside interference. What Elizabeth actually did during those 3 days was implement an elaborate confidence scheme that drew on her knowledge of human psychology and medieval superstitions. She had accomplices, family, friends, and distant relatives who risked their own safety to help her. These accomplices acquired actual gold thread through a network of sympathetic craftsmen who understood the life or death nature of her situation. The deception required precise timing and multiple layers of misdirection. Elizabeth would enter the spinning room with bundles of straw and emerge with spools of gold thread, but the actual transformation happened through careful substitution during moments when her observers were distracted. She used techniques that stage magicians would recognize: hiding prepared materials, manipulating lighting conditions, and controlling the flow of information to maintain the illusion. But the most sophisticated aspect of her deception was psychological. Elizabeth understood that her audience wanted to believe in her supernatural abilities because it served their financial interests. She played into their greed by suggesting that her powers could be used to generate unlimited wealth, but only if she remained free and willing to cooperate. She made herself more valuable as a partner than as property. The court records reveal that Elizabeth's plan worked temporarily. Her creditors were convinced enough by her demonstrations to renegotiate the debt terms, offering her freedom in exchange for ongoing services as their personal alchemist. But Elizabeth knew this arrangement was ultimately unsustainable. She couldn't actually transform straw into gold indefinitely, and eventually her deception would be discovered. This is where the Rumpelstiltskin story's name-guessing element becomes relevant. Elizabeth needed a way to permanently escape her creditors' control, and she found it by exploiting their own criminal vulnerabilities. During her negotiations, She had observed and memorized details about her traffickers' operations, their real names, their criminal associates, their methods of operation, and most importantly, evidence of their other illegal activities. Medieval law provided harsh penalties for human trafficking, but only if prosecutors could prove specific criminal intent and identify the perpetrators. Elizabeth possessed this information, and she used it as leverage. She offered her creditors a choice. They could attempt to enslave her and face criminal prosecution based on evidence she would provide to authorities, or they could forgive her father's debts in exchange for her silence about their operations. The final confrontation, as recorded in the court testimony, involved Elizabeth publicly revealing detailed knowledge about her traffickers' criminal network. She named specific individuals, described their methods, and provided evidence of their involvement in child trafficking operations across multiple territories. This wasn't magical knowledge. It was intelligence gathered through careful observation and systematic questioning during her captivity. The traffickers found themselves in an impossible position. Attempting to silence Elizabeth would only confirm her accusations and draw more attention from authorities. Allowing her to continue revealing their secrets would expose their entire operation. Their only viable option was to agree to her terms and hope she would honor her promise of silence. Elizabeth's survival strategy worked because it exploited the fundamental contradiction in her traffickers' position. They were criminals trying to use legal debt collection methods, which meant they needed to maintain plausible legitimacy while conducting illegal operations. Elizabeth's evidence could destroy this facade, making her more dangerous as an enemy than valuable as property. The court case that followed lasted 3 years because Elizabeth's accusations triggered investigations across multiple jurisdictions. Her testimony led to the arrest and prosecution of 27 individuals involved in trafficking operations, the liberation of dozens of children who had been illegally enslaved, and the establishment of new legal protections for debt-related family separations. But Elizabeth's victory came at enormous personal cost. She spent the rest of her life under threat from surviving members of the trafficking network. She never married, too dangerous for potential families, and lived under the protection of church authorities who valued her knowledge of criminal operations. Her survival was remarkable, but it wasn't a happy ending in any conventional sense. The Rumpelstiltskin story transforms Elizabeth's calculated deception and legal warfare into a tale of magical triumph over supernatural evil. The fairy tale preserves the essential elements: a young woman using cleverness to escape powerful predators who claimed ownership over her life, while hiding the brutal realities of medieval debt slavery and human trafficking. Elizabeth's real story reveals something the fairy tale obscures. Survival often required becoming something you never wanted to be. She saved herself not through innocence or purity, but through deception, manipulation, and the calculated destruction of other people's lives. Her victory was real, but it came at the cost of becoming as ruthless as her enemies. The miller's daughter wasn't rescued by clever wordplay or lucky guesses. She rescued herself through intelligence, courage, and the willingness to do whatever was necessary to survive. Her story isn't about magic. It's about the terrible choices medieval women faced when caught between legal systems that treated them as property and criminal networks that treated them as inventory. The spinning wheel stopped turning when Elizabeth chose to fight back rather than submit. But the price of that choice echoed through generations, preserved in a fairy tale that remembers the courage while forgetting the cost.